And we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Dutch Angler meetup. I'm pretty excited about this topic today. I know this thing. I've seen it in the past. I've never used it again, so I'm pretty excited about this. But before we go to our speaker, let's first go to our panel. Björn, how are you doing today?
I'm good. In the contrary of you, I've looked it up. I have an idea what to expect, but I've never used it before. So I'm also very excited about this. I'm just so curious what we're going to see today.
It's going to be fun and great. Just trust me.
I believe you.
And Sander, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I just did a 10-hour workday, 30-minute dinner, and now I'm here. And I'm actually looking forward to this. I did use NativeScript like a little while ago, a couple of years. So it would be good to see an update.
Well, let's go for it then. Nathan, welcome. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for talking or being open to talk about this topic.
Yeah, of course. We're pretty excited about it, and I think if you look at the Dutch country, we've used a little bit around this, but maybe a lot of people don't even know of the existence of Xplat. So I'm happy that we can share this knowledge to our people looking at us.
With that in mind, I want to provide everyone who listens to this little context of why these tools exist, and also kind of reiterate that these tools are not something you reach for every day. A lot of people who see Xplat, they might see it from afar or may come across it and say, I can't think of a case I would use that for. And you're probably right. These really aren't tools that you're going to use every day. It takes a specific case. We use them every day because we do a lot of large cross-platform developments. But if you're not doing large cross-platform developments, you're probably not going to reach for it. So it's good to understand kind of what the basis of these were originally and kind of why we developed these out and some context behind it. Go ahead.
I'm going to share your screen so that people also can see your screen, so you can go ahead with your talk.
So what Sander was mentioning, he mentioned NativeScript in context Xplat, and some people may know of NativeScript through the context with Xplat, and that's one of the aspects of Xplat, but certainly the goal of Xplat is sort of a broad goal. Number one, it's meant to be JavaScript-based primarily. There are some goals around it that can go beyond JavaScript, but its primary goal is to kind of create a fundamental workspace that you can do a lot of JavaScript at scale and do a lot of cross-platform work when you're trying to do JavaScript in different runtimes. So that's one of the goals. The other context for the background as to why they exist is sort of the common problem of creating a project and then a couple years down the line, revisiting it and realizing the whole world has changed. The whole tech stack has changed, and now this code and this project that you built.
That will never happen.
That will never happen, right? and this is really kind of a key thing that's really hard for anyone who's just getting into development to understand. When you've been working around software for quite a while, you know the software industry moves very fast. Things come up, seems like every day. And it's always tough when you're doing development work for a client or even just working with your team, and you get something going and you have some success and the project's moving along, and some large industry change occurs, and it creates perhaps some chaos amongst teams, some big decisions that need to be made, maybe large shifts that need to occur. And so Xplat is sort of founded in those problems in the beginning. How can you mitigate that risk going into the future if technology stacks change? And how can you allow your project to adapt to these situations as the industry is evolving, as tech stacks are changing? So Xplat is just a short name for cross-platform, and it's really intended to provide some fundamental lessons over the years from doing that type of work, developing projects that span different platforms. And how can you build it in such a way that can future-proof you for industry changes in the future? Generally, what this means is that if a platform you're developing with or a tech stack you're using today shifts slightly in the future or even perhaps goes away, how can you salvage and use a lot of code that you had written for that project and not have to just scrap the whole thing. Anyone who's been working in software for a while, especially around front-end technologies in particular, you may have done even personal projects that you did a couple of years back, and you kind of revisit it, and you're like, I just got to scrap that whole thing. I just got to rewrite this whole thing. And certainly that's fun. Sometimes it can be really painful if you've done it at scale in large, because usually undertaking or rewriting a really large code base, it can be painful and can take a lot of time. And of course, if you're working professionally, that can be a lot of delays for the client, and it can get uncomfortable when you have to be in that position. So Xplat is it's founded on all those fundamental situations of chaos in the industry changing, and just adapting JavaScript code in particular to different platform needs over time. The other thing about it is that we made a choice in the beginning with these tools to create them specifically for NX. And so for anyone that's not familiar with NX, the Norwal team, who is comprised of Jeff Cross and Victor Savkin, who used to work on the Angular team, created a great development services company, and they developed NX Dev Tools to be a really nice workspace to develop in. And it now crosses different platforms itself now. You can use Node in there, Express, you can mix React in there, Angular, and so it's really meant to be a really nice, solid workspace environment for you to develop all sorts of code, and a lot of focus on JavaScript, but you can do things, of course, outside of JavaScript in NX in general. So we made the decision early on to create tools specifically for NX because NX provided that basis, solid base that already had cross-platform leanings in it, in addition to things that you really want for long-term maintenance. And these are things like auto migrations. I was mentioning about that case where you developed a project a couple of years ago, and you.
Can I interrupt you? Do you also have slides, or are because we just see the white, just to be sure that we're looking at the right window?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I'm going to show some setup, and we're going to go through some details here in just a minute.
just checking in.
And in the case if we've broken your train of thought anyway, so would you like to wait with questions till the end, so we just gather them, and at the end we go through a couple of questions, or would you like us to interject questions as they arise? Whatever your preference.
Feel free to interject. I think that's totally fine. If there's something that you want to clarify, definitely feel free to stop me. Sure. People tell me all the time I can get going fast, and so feel free to slow me down. So let's see. Let me think of where I was.
Get back into it.
NX. So NX workspaces, we love them. We've loved them since the Norwal team introduced them, and we use them for all of our large-scale developments, specifically with Xplat involved. And the really nice thing about NX for us in large projects is that the migration story is really solid. And this is one of the goals, of course, of Xplat is to be able to maintain a project for a long time to come, even as things shift and change. And NX has a great story with that. And it all kind of goes back to Angular in general. Angular schematics, with which many people out there are probably familiar with, have the ng add and ng update, and you can auto migrate code bases. That's built in the hood with NX as well. So they often introduce migrations that help your whole workspace in general. So you can imagine a case where, for whatever reason, you didn't revisit a code base for a year, and you come back to it for whatever reason. You could probably NX migrate and bring that up to date with the standards of NX for the time, and also gain some auto migrations for some other tech stacks that are involved. And this is also what Xplat aims to do for the platform integrations that it adds. So with that in mind, let me go through some of the setup of Xplat to kind of put in scope what we're talking about a bit better. And as I mentioned, it's based fundamentally for NX, and so it always starts with creating an NX workspace. This is just straight from the NX documentation, npx create NX workspace. At latest, I always use just to make sure it pulls down the latest NX workspace. This is just really a shortcut to create a workspace here. And We often will choose empty whenever we create a workspace because we don't want it to lean one direction or another. It's just a plain NX workspace that we can then start adding the tools into and start building things kind of from a generic base here. So empty NX workspace. From there, you can install the in-studio Xplat tools, and we'll just install them as dev dependencies here. And this is going to do really one key thing, and it changes the default collection in NX workspace to use them by default. For those that are familiar with schematics, probably already know this. The default collection is really just what NXG generate or NG generate use by default without prefixing the schematic name in it. So whenever we install the tools in NX, we always set the default collection here because we generally use all of the schematics that come from Xplat when we're using Xplat with NX. So that is modified after the install. And from there, the intention for using Xplat is really to start with the app generators. And NXG app is always where it starts after you install Xplat. That's always going to give you a list of the generators that come with NX with the additions that come from Xplat, which is Electron, Ionic, NativeScript, and then you've got them all next to the other standard platforms that you get from NX in general. So I'll show an example here, just starting with generating a web app. So this is something most people are familiar with Angular in general. If you're not doing cross-platform work, most likely in Angular, you're probably doing web development. This web generation uses the NX web generator under the hood, and then Xplat does a couple tweaks to it to work with the architecture, which we're going to get into and what that's all about. So this is the generation of a web app. This is, again, a typical web app like you're used to with Angular. There's two things that Xplat does out of the box with everything it generates. It will always, by default, prefix the app with the platform that's being generated. So in this case, we can see it created web my app in this case. It will always prefix the platform just for clarity. If, again, this is more dealing with really large workspaces that we've dealt with before, and you can get confused on the surface when you have a lot of apps. Maybe app names are even the same, but they're actually deployed and distributed through a different platform. So for clarity, by default, we always prefix with the platform that's being generated. So this is a Angular web app. It's pre-configured with this cross-platform architecture by default. The cross-platform architecture provides a pretty distilled practice in code organization, and in particular, it tries to distill most of the common things that you're going to deal with cross-platform mixtures out of the box, and usually that's runtime configuration of different JavaScript services or Angular services, which is often referred to as core runtime configuration, and that's why there's a cross-platform core folder. The Xplat features folder is meant for additive things. These are things that are usually not core to your app, generally lazy loaded features, additional things that you're going to build, and that's usually additional Angular modules and that sort of thing. It also comes with a cross-platform SaaS setup that's pre-configured. So SaaS is always something that had been built in from the beginning because styling was something that was always desired to be reutilized across the platform spectrum. And we'll touch on some of those other platforms that can take advantage of that here. And then utils is really just a generic, often pure method scoped library inside of NX that you can reuse different utility methods and that sort of thing. So this is just running the web app on the surface. Again, nothing too particularly in terms of what you see. It's just a pretty standard web app. The one thing that it does do out of the box is it configures internationalization. This was another distinct decision that we made with Xplat in general, is that all apps generated with Xplat would always be pre-configured for internationalization. This is also because anytime we're doing large-scale enterprise apps with NX, these days for us, at least even for the past 4 or 5 years, it's always contained internationalization. So we build that in from the start.
Is that a native internationalization, or is that like a plugin?
Great question. We made the decision to go with NGX Translate from the beginning, and just NGConf last week, someone gave a talk on Transloco, which also looks really nice. So we may shift to Transloco here in the coming months, possibly by the summer, because it looks like a great successor to NGX Translate.
So, but is there a reason why you're not using the native one? Is that potential, or the native, the Angular one? Is that because of it doesn't do runtime?
That's right. So
yeah,
the main reason we're not using the native internationalization is the flexibility of it. All decisions with Xplat are really predicated on how flexible those are cross-spectrum across different platforms. NGX Translate always was super flexible. It was based in JavaScript, and you could use it cross-spectrum with many different platforms. So Transloco looks to be the same as well, and that's why I think Transloco will probably be a nice successor for it. But we can see here in the web app, this just loads an English set for the language. And I'm going to walk through now generating a mobile app inside here. And we'll kind of see the same things play out in here, and then we'll touch back on the architecture. It's easier to see and understand the architecture once you start adding apps in it and why it matters, and why that architecture is set up that way. So we generated a web app. Now we're going to generate a mobile app, and this time we'll use NativeScript to do it. And in a moment, we're also going to generate an Ionic app, and we're going to generate an Electron app here in a moment to see how this all kind of plays together. So from here, we can actually run an iOS and Android app. In this instance, it's going to use NativeScript. This is all tied into the same architecture that we saw for the web app as well. And we'll touch on kind of how that integrates together here. So this is just an iOS app. It's meant to be pretty bare bones, but it shows that the internationalization is already pre-configured and hooked up, because this label that's in the mobile app for iOS and Android is actually using the exact same NGX Translate integration that's already pre-configured with Xplat, and here just making a change to international files and seeing that change actually live reload inside of iOS and Android there. So let me pause there again, going a little bit fast there. So generated a web app. Now we generated a mobile app, and we used NativeScript to do it in that case. So we've got an iOS and Android app now in the workspace. We have a web app in the workspace. Now we're going to continue building out this workspace for more distributions. And this time, we're going to use Ionic. So we have a need come up in our organization, and Human Resources wants an app deployed out there. Ionic's a perfect stack for us to build this in. So we're going to use Ionic this time. And we're just going to choose the default settings here. This is going to create an Ionic app pre-configured as well. And we'll just launch that to see what it looks like. By default, it uses the standard template in Ionic. This is using just a top bar, pretty sample Ionic template app there. But again, pre-configured with internationalization too. So this has also got the same stuff built into it. So if you're starting to notice a bit of a common chord in all the app generation is that they're all pre-configured the same with the same things, internationalization baked in, and there's a hierarchy that's occurring as we're generating these apps that are all streamlined. And this is really kind of the point of Xplat, is really to create a streamlined, predictable setup that will avoid some of the pitfalls of cross-platform development. Anyone who's attempted their own kind of cross-platform mixture, there's a lot of ways to do cross-platform work. It's not a silver bullet. There's a lot of different approaches you can do with cross-platform and mixing them in. The problem that occurs usually at scale and with client work in general is that clients want predictability. They want stability. And if you're doing cross-platform work, you can introduce a lot of bugs, a lot of unpredictability, and a lot of time delays just by trying to kind of fiddle with cross-platform runtime configuration. It's not that it's hard so much as it is, there's a few considerations that if you haven't gone through it and gone through some of the pains of cross-platform configuration, you can really fall in pitfalls with. And that's really what Xplat is about, is just streamlining the configuration of that and really celebrating Angular a lot in the respect to do that, because we always created Xplat with Angular as the premier by default. Now, there's always been desires to bring in, I'll mention Vue and React in there, since NX can now do React inside the workspace too. So Xplat tooling probably will add Vue and React layers to it in the future, but it's always celebrated Angular's strengths by showing how you can use Angular features to configure cross-platform work. So I'll continue this example with Ionic here. This is adding capacitor into it. And there's a few scripts that are added to help with Ionic development in general. And when capacitor 3 gets released, we'll probably simplify some of these, because the Ionic team's done a great job with capacitor 3. And we can probably improve quite a few things with the integration with Ionic. And in fact, we have an issue on the repo now to integrate nextend, which is another great schematics library that a contributor for Ionic introduced, and it's really nice. So we probably will even use nextend under the hood with Xplat. This is another point that's worth mentioning with Xplat in general, is that it's always meant to be as minimal as possible and as non-disruptive as possible. So Xplat doesn't force you into Xplat. If you are generating apps with Xplat, you certainly are pre-configured with them, but you can use any schematic inside NX. So you can generate a standard Norwal Angular web app. You can use any schematic inside, and you can use it beside. You can build on top of Xplat. You can even build things even just totally outside of Xplat inside NX. And this was really the core reason why we liked NX in the beginning, is that it was just flexible in terms of allowing you to build and develop in the way that you need to for any particular case. So with that in mind, I'll just flesh the rest of these examples out here. So we generate a web app, native script app, we generate an Ionic app now, and now we added capacitor into it, and we'll just run that Ionic app with capacitor and just see what we've got here, just kind of showing the full scope of things that we can now add inside of our workspace. And we've got that Ionic app that we were seeing in the web browser just a moment ago. This is it running inside of capacitor. The latest Xplat tools today run with the latest versions of capacitor, which I think is 2.4.2.5. But I know capacitor 3 is in RC right now. So once that goes final, we'll be adding that. So now what I'm about to do here is we're going to continue through the app generator. So all of what we've been going through here is talking about the key aspects that Xplat brings to the table inside of NX. And those start with the app generators. The 3 extra platforms it brings in by default is NativeScript, Ionic, and Electron. And so we started out by generating a web app, and that was a standard Angular app. It actually uses Norwal Angular under hood to generate it. And then the Xplat tools do a couple modifications to it to tie it into the cross-platform architecture. And then we generated a mobile app using NativeScript that gave us an iOS and Android app tied to the same architecture. Then we generated an Ionic app, and it's also tied to the same setup. And now we're going to generate an Electron app. Now, what's interesting about the Electron integration with Xplat is that it allows you to target any existing web app in the workspace. So if you had, 5 or 6 web apps that you were developing in NX, you can actually add Electron using Xplat tools, and you can target any of those web apps. So it actually doesn't even need to be a web app that was generated with Xplat. It can be any web target that's in there. When you do nxg app, give it a name. We're going to call this desktop, and target is going to target the name of any web app there. We're going to choose Electron here. And this is going to create an Electron shell targeted at that web app. And this is just going to print right at the top how we can develop out that Electron app now. We'll just use this npm run start command here. And this is going to queue up a parallel process that's going to start that Angular app, which was that web my app that we created. And then it's going to start the Electron shell. And you get a live sync development flow in there that lets us live sync develop out our web app inside of Electron in this case. And it gives you sort of the Electron shell that you can start to customize for any particular desktop Electron development. So this is just showing a live sync change to internationalization files that are in our web app, just live reloading inside of Electron there. And Electron is a lot of fun to play with for sure. So that's a deep topic to get into in and of itself. So those are the app generators. Standard web app generator, Ionic, NativeScript, Electron, and that's kind of the starting base with Xplat, and that's usually where it all starts. And to kind of reiterate what I was saying in the beginning, you know, if you're doing a streamlined suite of apps for your organization, or you're working with a company that has a streamlined bunch of apps, that is really what Xplat is designed to help with. It's also designed to help with like white labeling. So if you create a architecture around a whole system of APIs that you have developed, or even a component library that you've developed, Xplat is meant to help streamline and create a way to white label a bunch of apps with that same architecture, whether it's shared auth services and also shared styling. So that's what I want to touch on next, which is kind of another key piece of Xplat, which is just shared SaaS. So let's take a look at what that is all about. So we can notice in the default libs that Xplat generates, each of the architecture layers are just NX libraries. You could actually create them by yourself if you wanted to. Xplat just generates these when you create the apps, depending on the platform mixture that you're adding in. And it's meant to be created in a hierarchical setup in such a way that you can reuse them through the platform spectrum. So libs Xplat SaaS is a library that houses SaaS that can be used by any of the platform features that you add in. So this is any of the apps that are in here. This is any of the shared code. And often when we're talking about shared code in scope of NX, we mean libraries. So libraries are generally imported and shared across apps generally, and even shared code itself. So this is a look at a variable SaaS set right at the lowest layer. And when we talk about layers with Xplat, we're really talking about an architecture design that's meant to be thought out to the extent that you can reuse what you're doing, as well as streamline a bunch of behavior. So in this case, we're defining a background color. We don't want to redefine that background color multiple times. And this is usually the problem that Xplat is solving, is how can we define once and reuse it as many times as we can, but be smart about, you know, how we define things and where we define things. I'll touch a little bit on that in the queue when we get to maybe some other questions. But so we're just defining a green color in this case. It's a background variable. And we're now going to go into the web layer. And again, this is another NX library, but this is meant to scope web-specific features and functionality just for the web. And just like we have core features for the web, we also have SaaS that's specific to the web. And inside here, we can go inside tags, which is something that's just provided out of the box. This is meant to be a place if you're going to provide element tags, you could define them here. And we're going to use that variable that we set up, background. And now we're also going to go into Ionic, and Ionic has its own tags, right? And so this is kind of where you start seeing the cross-platform stuff come to play into why. Ionic has its own tags. These tags in Ionic are not usable in the web without Ionic, right? They're also not usable inside of something like NativeScript because NativeScript doesn't know what those tags are. And so Xplat in general is meant to devise an architecture that lets you be smart about the way that you encapsulate platform behavior in your whole architecture. So we're going to go inside the SAS for Ionic, and we're going to define Ion content. Ion content is something that's not available in the web, like we were just saying, but we want to set and use the Ionic variables here to set the background color for our Ionic app, because this is the way you would want to do it there. You wouldn't want to use a page tag, for instance, or a body tag, as you might just with the web. And likewise, we also now want NativeScript to also adhere to the same streamlined style. So we can go here in NativeScript and configure a tag that's only available in NativeScript, right, which is a page tag. Page tag is something that's not available in Ionic, it's not available in Electron, not available in the web. But again, we're using that one variable that we defined already, and we're using it cross-platform here. So what we see when we launch the web app is that we get that green background color. Again, this is really just sort of fundamental rules with the way Xplat is designed. We also get the same green color background here in Ionic. And we also get the same green color here in iOS and Android. Now, what's important to note, of course, with all of that is that all of this was one color we defined in one single place, and we're just using that. And we're using it in the right way for that platform without bleeding into the other platforms. And that's really kind of the core issue that you run into when you start doing cross-platform work in general.
Are you then also able, if you don't mind me interjecting, because that was a very powerful example. I liked that very much to begin with. But with NX, you can do that scoping thing, you know, where the compiler will complain if you're importing from library you're not supposed to because the scope is broken. Is that something you can do with on an SCSS level then as well, or SAS level then, or is it a bit more on that top level native script part?
There's been some discussions around that. We've been working with a group the past couple months who's had a lot of input on trying to create the dependency tags with SAS. So you could actually allow the NX dependency graph to warn when certain SAS that's used for different platforms is used in others. We have some approaches to kind of bring SAS into a whole dependency graph. NX alone by itself doesn't have any particular SAS like tagging tools, but we have been looking at different ways to bring SAS into the dependency graph fully in the same way. And for those that aren't familiar with NX, NX has a really nice feature called the dependency graph, and it allows you to map out your stack in general and how things are interrelated. It sounds really kind of fluffy on the surface, but in practice, it actually can be pretty useful. Especially as like an architecture person, if you're really wanting to make sure that certain dependencies are only bleeding into the right areas of your code base, it can be really nice for that. But dependency graph is even useful in CI situations because the NX tooling works with it to determine what libraries affect different apps. And NX has tools in it that you can auto run an affected script and see what changes in the NX workspace affect certain apps. So you could potentially only deploy certain apps that are affected by a certain change, for example. That goes a little bit beyond this talk in general, just because those are kind of
NX specific,
pretty NX specific, but really nice advanced tools that NX provides around that stuff. And Xplat plays into all of that. So I guess what I could show. Perhaps let's take a quick look at the dependency graph here, because I think since we were just talking about it, it is nice to look at. So here is the dependency graph. And for those that were kind of like, what the heck did you just do there? I'm looking at an NX workspace that has Xplat in it, and it has the same set of apps that we were just looking at there. So we have an Electron desktop app. We've got an Ionic, in this case, used for a management setup. In this case, we've got a mobile app. This is a native script stack. This is iOS and Android. And then we've got a web app here. I also have NX console installed in VS Code. If you're using NX at all, highly recommend it. NX console is really, really nice. It provides a way to launch all of the schematics that are in your workspace. So it's a really nice like visual way to see what schematics are even available to you in your workspace. It also provides common NX commands here. And then it also provides a project navigator down here, which I particularly find super nice because this shows all the libraries that are in the workspace, and it shows all the apps too. And from here, you can even run different apps directly from here. If this is your style and you want to stay out of the terminal, you can also use the runners from here. Dependency Graph is what I just launched here, and when I did that, it just asked if I wanted to execute the Dependency Graph. It starts a local server, and it gives me kind of a visual on what's happening in the project right now, just from an architectural standpoint. So for instance, we've got this Ionic management app in here. And if we want to see what is related, we could turn on some of these libraries, and we can start to see how these different libraries are affected and actually play into the different apps in our workspace. So we'll take a look. We've got Ionic Core here, and we've got Ionic Features. And we'll notice something actually really helpful just from looking at the surface of the dependency graph. And this is really a nice way to understand even Xplat in general. Ionic Management is an Ionic app. We can see it has a dependency on Ionic features. That makes sense. It should have a dependency on Ionic specific features. It also has a dependency on cross-platform features. Cross-platform features are anything JavaScript-wise that can be used across all platforms, right? So these are Ionic specific cross-platform features. And whenever we see Xplat, what we mean generally from a lib sense is that Xplat Ionic features can be used across many Ionic apps in the workspace. So certainly it has a dependency from Ionic Management, but we might have another Ionic app. We've got another department or organization just came to us, let's say, and they want to deploy now an app to deal with safety hazards. You know, an industrial company has to take and monitor and regulate all these safety hazards. So now we want to deploy an app out there that lets these safety managers deal with that. We want to use Ionic to do it. So we do an NXG app, we choose Ionic, and we generate that. It would also have a dependency on Ionic features. So we can reuse some of the same hookups, some of the same services and things that we might have built into Ionic in general with our management app, and we can now use those for in our safety app, let's say. These cross-platform features here have a dependency on core, and this is kind of the whole fundamental cross-platform core that's provided with Xplat. It's mainly some runtime configuration. We'll take a look at that in just a moment, but it's what in particular uses Angular's strengths to provide runtime configuration of services. But we also see that Ionic Core comes down here, and then we've got these cross-platform utilities. Now, that's like looking at Ionic in general. So if we bring in something else here, let's look at NativeScript Mobile, okay? And we start turning on different libraries related to NativeScript. And we start to see, of course, some of Xplat describe itself a little bit better, perhaps. If you're not used to looking at these diagrams, if diagrams like these cause your eyes to glaze over, you're not alone. I find it rather boring myself, but it can be helpful just to understand what's going on. And it does help explain Xplat pretty well on the surface. Obviously, the key thing is that we've got two different apps here at the top, and they're in totally different tech stacks. Ionic and NativeScript, they both do very specific things. There are ways to use them together, but in this case, we see two different apps here, and we see that they have an architecture here that doesn't bleed into each other. And most of the problems with cross-platform development that you'll run into is when your stuff starts to bleed together, because quickly you're going to start to break a different app because you have Ionic features perhaps that are bleeding into, say, NativeScript features, and maybe vice versa. But even for web, if we bring in the web app here, and we'll see something interesting once we bring in the web app. Let me turn NativeScript off here for a moment. But as we mentioned in the beginning, you can't use Ionic features in a standard web app, right? Web is kind of a layer above, or Ionic is a step above web. So it adds features onto web. And then NativeScript kind of adds features on top of JavaScript in general. And so here we have a web app. We can see it uses the cross-platform core. We can see everything dips into cross-platform utilities, which is really nice because a lot of times people these days talk about composition over inheritance, a great concept to understand in general. And Xplat utils is all about that. Utils are compositional. They're often pure functions. They're reusable utilities. They are meant to be those composable bits that you can start to bring in. And cross-platform utilities generally are just JavaScript in a lot of cases. So you can use those across a whole lot of runtime options and stacks here. So this shows that there's no entanglement between the platform layers. And that's what Xplat is all about, keeping the platform entanglement clean, making sure it's manageable, making sure it's scalable. So you can continue to add different platforms and different things over time. It can grow to a very large scale. We have worked in massive NX workspaces with Xplat tools involved with 100 apps in it, hundreds of libraries, and you can scale it to massive size. And it doesn't mean that you can't gain benefits from it if you're just doing one or two platforms. But as I mentioned, it's not a tool you'll reach for every day just in typical kind of web development. But the minute you start kind of evaluating different platforms and different distribution strategies for your app, it can be useful. And that's where you might find some benefits from something like this. So that's the dependency graph. And just in general, it can help to give you a visual on what's going on. It helps to explain Xplat from an architectural standpoint, why it really matters. And again, the NX tools play into that to help you manage really large code bases in different app distributions with libs involved. So let's see, we were going through SAS. So you'd asked a question about the tagging in SAS and how you could play that into the dependency graph. And there's been some things that's kind of coming along there with SAS. And I would anticipate some more tooling around SAS in the dependency graph in time. I would anticipate that happening this year. But let's look now, and I know we're getting long here.
It's all right. This is very interesting.
The last piece I'm going to touch on is a component generator, because this is very much Angular specific. And this is perhaps where things start to get a little more interesting with Xplat in general. Xplat provides a suite of schematics on top of NX, and in particular, we're going to look at the component one and why this one matters in scope of Xplat in general. All of the Xplat generators usually have the cross-platform stuff built in, and we'll see right away that when we type a component name, we're using the InStudio Angular in this case, because this is an Angular-specific generator that comes along with Xplat, and it takes certain options. And generally, you're going to want to tell the generator if you want to generate a component specific to an app, or if you want to generate it specific to a platform. And then there's different options that you can configure depending on your case. So here, we're actually going to generate a component that we know we want to use on the web, and we know we also want to use it in NativeScript as well. So this is going to create a footer component, and it's going to pre-configure it for the web and NativeScript. Now, this is another benefit to using NX Console, is that by default, it always runs the schematics in dry run, so you get to see a really nice, clear visual as to what exactly that schematic is going to generate. So it's super clear, and it also lets you play with the options without being, committing anything yet and changing anything in your code base. So we can see on the surface, if we generate a footer component and we generate it for web and native script, it's going to do a couple interesting things. It's going to generate, in this particular case, a footer component for the web. It's going to generate one for native script, and it's also going to annotate both of their index barrels. Index barrels are a key thing in the way that we designed Xplat, because it's meant to reduce a lot of manual work. If you've been doing Angular for some time, you're probably used to creating a component and importing into the declarations of an ng module, for instance. The index barrels are meant to kind of take care of a lot of that for you, because all of the libraries in Xplat in the modules always create declarations that are index bound. So anytime you generate a component, it's going to annotate a collection of components that's already pre-wired with those particular modules. So you typically don't have to think about those kind of things. You can just generate a component, tell what platform you want, and start using that component right away. So obviously, the first thing that most people react to when they see something like this is they say, wait a second, this looks incredibly ridiculous. Why would you want to create a duplicate footer component over here in this one platform and then in another place? Isn't Xplat all about code reusability, and what's all this duplication I see? And it's a great question. It comes up a lot whenever we go through this. So the next thing I want to talk about, two things in scope of this. Probably code clarity and maintenance go hand in hand. And then there's also the idea of inheritance, and like I was talking, composition over inheritance. Oftentimes I hear out there, go one way or another. And usually when I hear strong opinions of don't use that, use this, it's usually always a red flag to me, because usually there's leaving out a lot of context. There's a lot of great things and lessons in programming over the years, and all of them are useful. And it's good to know about all of them. And in the right context, all can be useful. And inheritance is one of those things that is very useful, but you do want to know how to use it. And there are pitfalls to inheritance that are valid in terms of arguments that you hear today when you hear about a lot of composition over inheritance debates. But that comes in scope here because there's an option with this component generator, and it's called create base. Create base is actually going to create an abstract component. Some people are going to scream, abstract components, no. This just came up in ngconf last week. Someone asked a question about this on the experts panel, and John Papa provided some opinions there too. And abstract components, again, you really want a specific purpose to use them. A lot of times when you hear about composition over inheritance or abstract components, they're talking in scope often of a singular app. And it's very valid. If you're using inheritance in a single app, it's very likely that it's going to grow out of control pretty quick, because perhaps you don't need inheritance in a single app, right? You probably can get away with composition a lot better. Where that shifts is when you get into cross-platform work. Cross-platform work can benefit a lot from inheritance because you actually really want to bind something to a common state, but you want to be responsible in the way that you do it. What I always like to bring in as a metaphor when I talk about abstract components and the concept of a base component deriving and creating a base to two other Angular components is I like to bring it in scope of what you have in your hand, likely at the very moment, or what you're sitting in front of. Mac OS, Windows, iOS, Android, all of those platforms are built with inheritance. Spoiler alert. They are inheritance bound. The biggest platforms you use today are architected with inheritance. Does that mean they did it wrong? No. That means that inheritance is a good thing. You just want to know how to use it. Most people that do inheritance are constantly tending to their garden. You want to be sure that you're responsible in the way you do it. The question that came up in ngconf last week was related to the most common thing that occurs with inheritance, and that is that when somebody creates a base component, and when we talk in base component, we're talking about an abstract component that has some stuff in it, that other devs are going to inherit from and to create a concrete component, something to actually use in your code base. The thing that typically occurs is that someone creates a base component and everyone starts adding a bunch of stuff to this base component. And then everyone just inevitably starts inheriting from that base because they're like, oh yeah, that's got a bunch of like neat stuff in there and I probably need to use like 2 of those things. And so I'm just going to inherit from that and go from there. That's usually where the debate derives from. And it's a valid debate and it's a valid problem. It does happen. And this is really where it comes down to a pretty just disciplinary area with abstract components. In cross-platform work, they're really useful. In this case, we actually want to create a footer component, and we really do want to bind that footer component. But there's something very distinctual happening here. We're creating a footer-based component that's specific for a footer component. What happens most of the time with development teams with abstract components is they create a pretty generic base component and then they use it for everything. The way Xplat uses base components is very specific. It's for a very specific purpose. And as you scale them, you can actually introduce other layers of base. And you'll see this across iOS. You'll see this in Android. If you've ever looked at API docs for any architecture that has been matured over time and grown large scale, you'll see a really systematic approach to inheritance. So it can be very useful. And Xplat is about architecting a system for your company and for your enterprise or for your project that is to span cross-platform, be manageable, be maintainable, be predictable, and it's very intentional to architecture building in general. And inheritance plays a role in that. So this footer base is going to be an abstract component. It's pre-wired already to the footer components for these platforms. And probably the question I didn't answer originally here is why do we create 2 components per platform? This comes down to view decoration. So usually the platform lines that you deal with in cross-platform work come down to view decorations. And what we're talking about is view markup, basically. Ionic has its own view markup. If you're not super familiar with Ionic, it has its own set of components. Those components can only be used in the scope of an Ionic built app. NativeScript is the same. There's components there that can only be used in the scope of that because it's a specific view markup. So Angular, of course, with all of its power, allows you to decorate a component and tie it to a specific view template. And this is where that power is sort of seen through with Xplat and Angular specifically, because these footer components, although you see duplication in what's created here, in practice, it actually avoids a ton of duplication because all that's happening here is we're just decorating the component for you to isolate and not platform bleed your work here. So you can just get in and dial that footer specifically for iOS and Android. You can dial it specifically for web, and then you can derive the same base there from the footer base. But keep in mind, this is just for a footer base. No one else would ever derive from footer base because why would you? It's the base to the footer. So it's very specific in the way that the inheritance tree is set up, in the way that Xplat deals with base components. We'll kind of play that out here in this example. So footer-based component, we're just going to set a string variable here. We can see in our web component, we've just got a text binding there. We're going to class it with footer just to give it a little bit of style. We're going to go here in our web Sass, and we're just going to add a Sass style here for the footer. This is just going to give us just the little ability to touch the style of it. Now we're also going to do the same thing for NativeScript here, and we'll show kind of how that plays together. So that's our footer component for the web. And again, that is the selector right there. And we're going to add it right to the bottom of our web app. So again, footer component, we're adding it on our web app. Now we're going to go to Ionic. We're going to add the same thing. And this is really a neat aspect of the way that Xplat is designed. It's meant to build on top of the way the platforms are naturally extending each other. Ionic is a natural extension to web. So there's no reason you couldn't use anything that you built for the web in Ionic. It's just you can't use anything from Ionic back in the web, right? So again, it's all about that platform separation and avoiding entanglement. Because we built a footer component and we built it for web and NativeScript, And because Ionic derives from the web, of course we can use that footer component here because Ionic's built on the web. So we just use that footer component here in Ionic. Now we're going to run the web app, and we can see there's our footer component right there at the bottom. Very simple example, but again, was a component generator that generated this for us. Now we're going to run the Ionic example, and lo and behold, we have, of course, exactly the same footer there. It's built on the web. It's the same component. We didn't have to create something new. Again, this is kind of Xplat at work here. We're starting to use things with clean platform separation, with intent. And now we're going to do the same thing for NativeScript. Kind of a silly example for NativeScript because I don't know many mobile apps out there that have a footer. In fact, I can't even name one. Well, maybe Google Suite has one. But again, this is just an example. But we're going to take the same selector. And here's the other beauty of Xplat is that it's streamlined, it's consistent, it's predictable. We just generated a footer component. Of course, the selector is exactly the same. That's its intent. When you use the selector and scope of NativeScript, it's actually going to use the NativeScript component decoration for that same component. But your mentality doesn't have to think about something different. It's named exactly the same. You created a footer component. What's it called? It's the same selector in web. It's the same selector in Ionic. It's the same selector in NativeScript. That is the point. So we're going to go here. We're going to add that footer here. We save it. And now, of course, we get basically the exact same setup that we have on web. But we're going to see that in a totally different view markup, totally different view components, not even DOM-based here. But we get the exact same behavior, and there's a footer at the bottom. Now, on the surface, you can look at that and say, well, yeah, I mean, we just looked at the footer. But what you have to understand is that this is a totally different platform we're looking at here. This is actually an iOS view. It's not even using the DOM at all, but we're actually streamlining the whole development process and how we're dealing with it, even though the platforms are wildly different. And that's kind of the fundamental stopping point right there. But that's the basis of the component generation. And
Nathan,
yeah.
I have a question about inheritance. I see why you are using inheritance on the footer, but when you opened up your footer, it was like already inheriting from a base class, and I was kind of suspicious about that.
Let me go back there. So right here.
Yeah, you have a footer base component in another one.
Yeah, the footer base component itself, where the actual text is defined. That one.
Oh, yeah. Let me go
there.
there.
Base component as well to extend from.
Great question. Great question. Let me go back there.
You always see everything, Sander. You don't miss anything.
I have heard that about Sander. I would expect nothing less. That is a great question, though, and I'm really glad you stopped on that.
Yeah, there extends base component, and I got the whole deal with the inheritance for like footers. But here you're extending from a base component, and there is where I'm going.
This is a great question, and also a common one that comes up. So this was another distinctual decision we made based on the ability to easily unsubscribe from subscriptions. There's a lot of solutions now today for this thing, but to date, I haven't seen a solution that handles it as elegantly without new APIs as inheritance. I'll be honest. Just subscription teardowns are instance bound, okay? They're always instance bound to your component. If you're creating and subscribing a component, it needs to be destroyed in the scope of that component. There's nothing that handles that better than inheritance. If you can use a decorator, sure, that's great, but a decorator is foreign to most Angular developers. You have to learn the decorator. It's a new decorator. And a lot of these new decorators I've seen have their own API. So yet it's a new API you have to learn. So what we made the decision of with Xplat is that all components with Angular would be derived from a singular base component that's meant to be thin. In fact, this base component in the largest workspace that we've worked on with hundreds of apps, hundreds of libs, has not changed a smidge. It's made exactly the same. And the sole purpose of it is to make subscription management easy. So if we take a look at what that looks like, base component is literally just a way to take a destroy and wire in. And all it allows you to do is in the scope of a method. Actually, it's probably better looked at in a component. So if we take a look at web, and let's say we had some subscription here. What could I do? Subject. Let's do new subject. And we had subject.pipe. And you can do take until. And let's just have an operator here.
It's with an S.
Operators, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Operators. Yeah.
Operators. So take until this dot destroy. And this is really what the whole fundamental basis of the Angular tree with Xplat was meant to be bound to. And in practice, we've seen development teams rejoice over this in particular, because there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I to date have not seen anything more elegant than this. But take until was recommended by Ben Lesh, if I'm not mistaken, in the first article that he wrote about managing subscriptions well.
Yes, that's correct. It's an old one.
And I love that article because I thought he hit it on the nail. I think it's a beautiful way to manage it. So every component in Xplat derives from base component to give you this and that alone. Just the ability to take until this dot destroy.
And you might even want to call it then lifecycle hook based component. To make it a little bit more explicit, yeah.
That's actually not. That's a really good idea. That's a good idea. Yes, yeah.
I have a different opinion on this take until construction, but let's not go there now. Let's
maybe after show in the Hangouts.
Yeah, I tell you, it's a debatable topic. I understand, and it's like with anything with Angular at scale. Angular is awesome because it provides you the ability to do a lot of things a lot of different ways, and that's beautiful and also maddening at the same time because sometimes you just want somebody to tell you, here's the best way to do it this way. And the fact is with Angular, there's often not a silver bullet like that. There's a lot of great ways to do a lot of great things. So it does often come down to a little bit of opinion. It comes down to a little bit of vibe, which way that you like best. So yeah, this was a distinctual, opinionated decision that we made with Xplat in the beginning that we wanted to distill this down. All I'll say about it is that in practice with many teams, diverse teams across the globe, totally different backgrounds, have gotten this without a single blip. And there's not to date been a single app at scale that we've developed in here that someone has had a leaking subscription because of this. So it served its purpose.
Speaking about opinionated decisions you've made, or you and the team have made, we got a great question coming in from the chat. Jeff, you want to
sure
hand in there? But I mean, we can click it open here and just see where we get. But so Tom White asks you, why did you create your own library architecture instead of basing it on Narwhal's Enterprise Angular monorepo patterns? With the additional question of if it was evaluated or maybe compared. I'm not entirely sure what he's getting at, of what Manfred Steyer did.
I think I know what he's talking about.
Okay.
Or correct me if I'm wrong out there. I believe you're referring to just lib generation in general, perhaps in tagging. Is that correct?
Yeah, what I think he's referring to, I think the Narwhal team, but also Manfred, they made like a PDF with some recommendations on how to set up your workspace. For example, the feature folders, I think that's one of the things that's there, but it should be a little bit more like split it in a specific feature and not under the Xplat, for example.
Good
And
question.
I think Manfred did it even more like domain driven, where you explicitly use some domains and have a specific structure on it, like feature, for example, but also like shared or UI or that kind of stuff.
That is a great question. Yeah, this is another thing that does come up often. So the one thing that is important to understand about Xplat in general is that it is an NX library in and of itself. So it is actually just a structure like is recommended. The reason that features is here is actually to avoid some of the riffraff and decision making along when you create a lib or not. And if you've done an exit scale, this is actually pretty hard. It kind of fits back to why naming is so hard. Naming things is always difficult in software, and when to create a lib is also a difficult decision. Creating a lib affects the whole workspace. And if you create a lib for some purpose that perhaps wasn't the best idea to create a lib for, or maybe there was another lib that would have been better to just group the code in, it can affect the whole team. Because you've got another lib in there, it affects the dependency graph, and now you've got to think about that lib and also be aware of it. So it really comes down to trying to reduce some initial decision-making to scale the code base out without limiting you to make those decisions when you're ready to make those decisions. So like Manfred in the suggestions or any best practices around lib generation, do that. Use that. If you know that, generate them. Like right now, we could create using Norwal library or Norwal workspace library. Let's do this, and let's create auth. I think the default settings are good, and we'll just run that. And you can see what we now have is just an auth library. Totally fine. Do this all the time. In fact, we do this a lot with Xplat. Xplat is often just the base. That's the streamlined common denominator to help reduce a lot of riffraff and cross-platform scalability. How you design and develop other libraries above and beyond that, aside that, how much of the Xplat layer you use is totally up to you. That's really where it comes down to what you're doing. What specifically are you trying to solve? We do this a lot. I used auth as an example because it's one of the most common NX libraries we generate almost out of the bat with any project that we develop. Auth usually encompasses some auth services that are used throughout. And then if we have platform-specific features, we might generate features inside of specific platforms that then also consume that auth library. So Xplat can consume other libraries that you have in NX as well. But again, those are architectural decisions that when you're starting out, they can be really hard to make. Software development is hard at scale, and it's decisions like that become burdensome when you're just trying to scale things out. So Xplat layer is meant to provide enough of a structure that helps you keep things isolated, helps you keep it clean, helps you kind of get going and scale, and then features by themselves could be broken out into own NX libs anytime as well. And actually, we've talked about creating a flag, a checkbox that you could check when you create a feature inside of Xplat that you could designate a separate NX library when you do it. In that way, if you know you need to do that, you can do that easily. In addition to have an extra power refactor command. So if at any point you generated a feature in Xplat that you wanted to then refactor later to a standalone NX library, you'd have just a simple command you could run, and it would just break it and flatten it to an NX library. So yeah, a lot of the Xplat structure was just to try to help avoid some of those harder decisions up front. And they really can be tough. I have a tough time with them all the time. In any development, just deciding what to break into a library, what even to call that library, and those sorts of things.
Alrighty. I think we're running towards the end, I think, as well. I think we have one more question here, and it kind of ties in nicely with Sander's question earlier, I think, because Tom White also asked if your schematic allows an option where we have a base component not being used as the base there. Is that something that the out-of-the-box generation from Xplat offers, or is that not yet something that you've considered there?
So just a component standalone that generates not tied to any base at all, not even the base component, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, you could just run the
Angular one then,
component.
Yeah, no, that's like, if you want to keep using the Xplat, I can imagine, like, you have to create a base component here, but that one will always inherit the original base component.
Yeah, let's create one here, and we'll just create it for the web in this case. We'll just call it isolated component, and let's generate this here. So by default, let's take a look at it. I think we can command click here. we can see it does by default always derive from that base. So yeah, if that sounds like a really good option to be able to detach that, or say, you for sure don't want that to detach. That for sure was one of those opinionated decisions that we made. If you're not going to create a base for that component, that we automatically extend that base just as the fundamental rule. And the fundamental rule is that if you're generating Angular components, we want to streamline the way all the developers do subscription teardowns.
Yeah.
And that was through this.destroy, yeah.
I mean, considering coming from an opinionated library, it makes sense to have something like this. And if you don't want to tie into that opinion right there, you can just, it's literally removing two words, right? Maybe
right.
remove the super and you're done, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And you can tear that and it's isolated, but obviously that right there is annoying enough. That,
sure, but that's the whole point of an opinionated library, so that kind of makes sense. If you're buying into that into that opinion, if you're buying into the library, you either agree with it or not, and that will help guide your decision if you want to stick with that or not, I guess. So.
Right. Well, I'll tell you one thing I do want to mention before we get off the topic of abstract components entirely, and one thing I will mention is that a lot of people get caught up in the muckery with abstract components around constructor signatures. And this is also another very valid point that often gets just attacked on abstract components in general. Abstract components suck real bad when you are constantly changing the constructor signature. Because if you have a base component that you're injecting new stuff, and this course happens a lot in Angular development, you need new service, you want to add and inject it in there. If you inject it in a base component that a lot of components derive from, you've now broken all of those components, because you then have to go and inject that constructor signature. So a pattern with abstract components that I always use, if you're going to use a well-disciplined approach with abstract components and really use them well, you can always introduce a service that provides the public getters for those extra things. So you could have a service that is an intermediate between all your components and these other services. So it acts as a nice layer to get at any service that you want to provide access for without changing the constructor signature. And that's a pattern that helps usually solve that abstract component issue that a lot of people kind of get pretty confused with on how to do that and do it without it being so disruptive.
So your injecting a proxy service really helps there. Right. I agree with that, yeah.
Yeah, if you had something here, export class, and this was going to be, you could call it app service. An app service itself you can modify this constructor all you want. You can have 10, 20 services injected in here. It can change over time, can change over years. Doesn't matter. Doesn't affect your abstract tree, because this, in essence, would have public accessible services themselves. So this might be something like your API service, And then if app service is something that is in your inheritance tree, you don't have to change your inheritance tree injection. You can change it here, and because all your inheritance tree has app service there, you can access all those things from there. And that's a way to avoid that common problem.
Okay.
But again,
yeah.
All I should say anytime I mention abstract components is it's always a careful line to draw, because I feel like a lot of people hear abstract component talk as, use abstract components all the time. And it's like with anything, it's often not all one way and all another way. With abstract components, it's more about understanding the usefulness of them and being disciplined about them. And Xplat, I think, holds true to that rule. And the fact that you use abstract components for a particular purpose with cross-platform development, which is the key thing where they become useful. It's not about using so much inheritance for one platform. It's about the usefulness in cross-platform.
Yeah, it totally makes sense, because a footer has like a default text, and the text is the same for all the platforms. The way you display it is. So for that use case, it makes total sense. And you explained the whole problem with inheritance pretty well, so I will not go over that.
But we use a lot of pure methods. We use a lot of composition, and I mean that's the thing with Xplat utils that's embedded. Each layer has its own set of utils. So if you need platform-specific utils, you can bake those in. Like NativeScript has a set of utils here, right? And you can build platform-specific utils. I mean, these are composable. These are reusable methods, right? That you can then import and use to compose different things. And so we use a great combination of that. I always lean on composable methods first. I mean, inheritance, again, it's always for a specific purpose. It's always pretty isolated. And I use a lot of composable pure methods. Definitely very useful.
Yeah, I would normally advise completely against inheritance, but this is one of the use cases where it's like a perfect solution for the use case. The problem with inheritance is that it, in hands of junior developers, it usually goes south pretty quick.
Yep.
Well, one thing I can put in context of that really helps bring that full circle is like forms and Angular, really powerful, whether you're doing template-driven or reactive. If you've ever done a lot of form work, boy, you don't want to do that over and over again. And also with forms, when a bug comes up, you better hope that same bug occurs across platform. Because if it doesn't, you got a nightmare on your hands. So this is a case where inheritance really helps, because if you're using inheritance right, and you're using forms, whether it's reactive forms or template driven, and that base is defining that behavior cross NativeScript, cross Ionic, cross web, you better hope the bug's the same in all those, because that means you can change it in one place and fix it in all. And that's what you want. That's where inheritance really benefits you if you're using it right. And your client is then in awe because you just fixed 4 tickets that were in their ticket system in one go in less than 30 minutes.
You get better bricks than I get.
Shall we slowly wrap them up, or is there another part? Yeah.
Nathan, did you have something else you want to show, or can we just get along with a couple of questions still?
Oh yeah, a couple questions.
You haven't even thrown out your Twitter and all that, man. Come on.
I feel unusual in that regard. My Twitter is Walker Run, WWWALKERRUN. I am on the NativeScript TSC Technical Steering Committee, which is a global group of about 14 developers that will probably grow to 21, perhaps before the end of the year. And as far as Xplat goes, it is something we use every day on multiple large-scale developments. And if you need help with it or have questions about it, certainly feel free to ask. And I would say, just for everyone's comfort, you're not alone in thinking you don't know of what case you would use it for. That is very normal. It's as we were saying in the beginning, it's a pretty specific case, and it's really meant for large cross-platform work.
Okay, great. So I got a small question. I looked up the repository of Xplat because I was curious how you're doing a couple of things. And what surprised me a bit was that you're doing like a whole bunch of only schematics, where I expected a little bit of builders at least. So is that something you're investigating, or did you want to just do it as is? Because you're now doing a couple of things like commands where you say, okay, specifically npm run for the Ionic app with these settings, and I can see something like where you can just use a builder for that, a Xplat builder or something like that. So I was just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Great question. Builders was one of those kind of long sought after things for me personally with schematics that I wanted to get into. And they weren't super mature at the time when we first started doing Xplat. And so it was one of those things that got better and better. And NativeScript NX, for instance, is the first one that uses a proper builder. And actually, in the latest version of Xplat, actually uses this builder under the hood. So if you were to generate a workspace today and add a NativeScript app in it, it actually uses this custom builder under the hood. And we probably will start doing more builders from here on out. So that is a great comment. And I really prefer builders now myself. But the fact that there's not more of them in there is probably more a fact that it was built at a time when builders were young, and it's just taken some circling back to get there.
Yeah, well, I think they're now like pretty stable-ish these days. So definitely everybody that's watching, go check out, by the way, the repository. I see a couple of issues that people are doing or want to start with some open source. They can heavily just do them. So go check that out as well. Maybe I even just do something there just for fun.
A couple people have commented on the prefixing. I know that's a topic that's come up over the years a lot, is kind of the default prefixing it does on libraries and apps. And that is something that probably will change and become purely an option. The most cases I've heard is that a lot of people do like to prefix, but they like to use their own prefix. Like they want a prefix, instead of it be like nativescript-mobile, be ns-mobile. They want like shorter prefixes and that sort of thing. So that probably will come probably in the next 3 months. There's a lot of things happening in the next 3 months around several developments, Xplat and also NativeScript and Ionic. Again, hopefully NX Extend can be worked into Xplat just as the default Ionic layer.
Sounds cool. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing. I don't have any other questions. Bjorn, Sander, do you have one?
I think I've asked my questions as we went, so I'm satisfied.
Yeah, me
Really,
too.
really good questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all about this, for sure. Thank you, Jeff, Bjorn, and Sander. Always nice to see you. And if there are any follow-up questions that come up on the Meetup channel there, we can perhaps group them together and we can try to answer them up there. And, you know, I really appreciate the attention.
Yeah, happy to have you.
Our pleasure.
We just got a question again from Tom. Does NativeScript v8 unit test work now?
Yes. Myself in particular, and Eduardo, who's on the TSC, is in the process of writing a blog post on this. Yeah, we have revised the unit test runner quite a bit. We improved the UI in it, and we probably will release a 2.0 of that unit test runner. Most likely, it would be in the next 3 weeks. And the main reason for that is one of our members on the TSC, Igor Rangelovich. He is a university student, and he's writing his thesis right now. And when he's done with his thesis, he is going to help us wrap up one aspect of that. So yes, very soon. And we're going to try to have a blog post that details that, as well as a isolated doc on the new docs for that.
Okay, great.
Right.
Tom, I hope this answers your questions. I think it was, but if not, just ping the guys from NStudio for Xplat, and they will help you. They're there for you. Okay, then let's wrap it up. Thank you, Nathan, for your talk. I'm really impressed with Xplat and how far it is already. I'm definitely going to just check it out upcoming week somewhere. Thank you, Sander. Thank you, Bjorn, for being here again. And well, until the next meeting. That's probably next week. Is it the week after?
Yes, no, always a pleasure. And next week we have Jay Bell talking about NGRX data and WebSockets. So that should be
Ooh, that's going to be good.
quite intense. Yeah.
Until the next one. Bye, guys.
Have a good one.
Take care, everyone.